In this video, I'd like to show you how you can use a t-table to find a p-value. For any t procedure, once you calculate the degrees of freedom and your test statistic, then the finding of the p-value is the same thing for any type of procedure. So you can use this for a one-sample t-test or any other type of t procedure. Let's look at the first example. Let's suppose our degrees of freedom are 12 and our test statistic is a negative 2.46. What we can start with is we can start by finding our degrees of freedom row. This is 12 on our t-table, and so we want to scroll across this row until we find the absolute value of our test statistic. Notice how all these are positive. That doesn't really matter. We want to just find where our test statistic falls, and we have to use the absolute value of it, which is going to be right here. Our test statistic was 2.46 for this example, the absolute value anyways, and we see that it falls between these two values, 2.179 and 2.681 on the table. If we scroll up to the top, we notice that that corresponds to these p-values, or significance levels. If we're doing a one-tailed procedure, that means that our p-value has to fall between 0.01 and 0.025. If we're doing a two-tailed procedure, so we're just asking if there's no difference is our alternative, is then 0.02 to 0.05. All right, so moving on. Let's suppose we have degrees of freedom of 30. What happens if our test statistic is 5.69? Well, again, we start with the same procedure, go down to the degrees of freedom row of 30. We can find that here. Scroll across the row until we find our test statistic. And what we find is our test statistic is somewhere over here. It's way off the table. So what does that mean if our test statistic is larger than the largest value on this table? Well, it just means that our p-value is less than the smallest p-value on the table. So for a one-tailed test, we find that the p-value is less than 0.0005. For the two-tailed, our p-value is less than 0.001. All right, so for our last example, let's go ahead and look at the degrees of freedom for 68 and the test statistic of 1.83. So if we scroll down to 68, we find that it's actually not on the table. So what do we do if our degrees of freedom are just not listed? Well, unfortunately, the t-table is imperfect in that it can't list all of the degrees of freedom. So it starts to kind of cheat a little bit once our degrees of freedom get larger. Well, what we do is we have 68 degrees of freedom, then we always round down. We round down because we have at least 60 observations where we don't have 80. So even if we're super, super close to the upper degrees of freedom, we always take the floor or round down. So we go across the 60 degrees of freedom row and we find where our test statistic falls. Our test statistic again was 1.83, so if we scroll up and scroll back down, we notice that 1.83 falls between these two values, 1.671 and 2.00. If we go up, we can see that that is between these two p-value values. So that means that our p-value for this example will fall between 0.05 and 0.025 for the one tail, and for two tail, it'll be between 0.05 and 0.10. Notice how the two-tail p-value is simply just the double of the one tail. Always make sure that you understand when to use a one-sided or two-sided test. Again, hopefully this video helped you find p-values from a t-table.